Hello, economics students. Hey, today we're going to talk about a fun subject. We're going to talk about money and how you create money. And I thought I'd start off with this picture here. This picture was taken at a place you probably have seen at some point in your life. At least there's a good chance of it if you grew up in Illinois. That's downtown Chicago on LaSalle Street. There at the end of the block is the Chicago Stock Exchange building, where huge amounts of dollar transactions take place every day. But the real reason I'm showing you this picture is the building to the right over here. That building to the right is the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. And we're going to be talking a lot about the Fed, as we call it, the Federal Reserve Bank in the Federal Reserve System. We call the Fed. We'll be talking a lot about the Fed in the next week or two or three. So let's go ahead and get started. I want to start with an example of money creation. So let's imagine that you were paid $5,000 for renovating someone's kitchen. You deposit that $5,000 in the bank. Even though the bank is holding that money, does that money belong to you? Well, of course it does. That $5,000 is yours, and the bank is simply holding it for your convenience. Now, let's assume that the bank takes your $5,000 and they loan it out to your neighbor who wants to use the money to buy a used car. Once the bank lends that money to your neighbor, does that money belong to him to do with whatever he wants? Well, the answer to that question is also yes. So what has happened here is that when you deposited the money into the bank takes that money, which is yours, and they lend it out to someone else. Once they've lent that money out to someone else, that money becomes theirs to do whatever they want to. By doing this, the bank has just created $5,000 in new money. It's still your money, but it's also the money of the person who received the loan. So this is a really important concept that we're going to be dealing with in the next several weeks. So the way that money is created is through bank loans. This is the key point of today's lesson. Money is created through bank loans. So let's talk about how this whole system got started. The very first European bankers were goldsmiths. A goldsmith is someone who basically makes something out of gold. Okay, so let's talk about the role of goldsmiths and that they played in the creation of our modern economic system that we use in money management. So, how would goldsmiths make money? Well, a goldsmith would store people's gold for safekeeping. Imagine that you're living in the Middle Ages. This is not a time of really effective law and order. Perhaps if you have some gold, then you might be a little bit concerned about the safety of your gold, the safety of your wealth. Goldsmith's job is to work with gold, so they certainly would have a safe way to store gold. So you could go to the goldsmith and ask them to store your gold for them, and they would probably be willing to do that for a small fee. Now, the goldsmith knew that people would rarely ask to withdraw all of their gold at one time. The goldsmith is going to be storing gold for a lot of different people. Since they know that that people will not withdraw all their gold all at one time, they would be willing to lend some of their gold that they're holding for others to other people. And when they do that, they will charge a small fee, which we would call interest. Okay? So a fraction of the gold, though, that the goldsmith is keeping for others will be retained by the goldsmith. They're not going to lend all of the gold out because you may come to them at some point and say, hey, I need my gold back, for whatever purpose. So the goldsmith needs to be sure that they are always keeping some of the gold on hand that they're holding for other people, but they would lend a big chunk of it out for those who would like to borrow money. And of course, they will make interest when they do that. But whenever that goldsmith lent gold out, they would be creating money, just as we saw in the previous example with your $5,000 that you deposited into the bank when you did that kitchen renovation. Eventually, though, the goldsmiths would stop lending the gold, because after all, gold is heavy. It's not particularly practical to carry gold around all over the place. So the goldsmith would stop lending the gold, and they would just lend out paper receipts. What do you suppose those paper receipts would actually become? Well, there's an example. The paper receipts would actually become the first paper money used in the Western economic system. Paper receipts for gold would be paper money. and eventually people would just trade the receipts rather than trading actual gold coins. So, what is money? This is not actually as obvious a question as you might think. There are actually several things that constitute money. First of all, we're going to use the basic definition of money, which we call M1. M1 consists of cash in circulation. Cash in circulation means the money that you have in your wallet, the money that is in the cash register at the store. That's cash in circulation, and circulation is key. Money that is held in the bank, that is cash that is held in the bank, is not in circulation. Money is only in circulation, that is cash is only in circulation when it is out of the bank and being used in transactions of business. Keep that in mind. Cash held in the bank is not in circulation. It is not a part of the money supply. Demand deposits are a part of the money supply. That's probably a term you're not familiar with, so we actually usually use the term checking accounts. A demand deposit is a checking account. So cash in circulation, actual dollar bills and change, that is money, as are the checking accounts that you hold. That is the amount of money that is in your checking account. There's also a definition of money which we call M2. It includes the two items up there in M1 plus less liquid accounts like money market funds, certificates of deposit, and other savings accounts. Basically, M2 includes savings accounts in addition to demand deposits or checking accounts. Cash held in the bank is not part of the money supply. This is the most important thing you need to understand from this slide. If it's in the bank, it is not part of the money supply. Now remember, when you deposit money into the bank, you're probably putting it into your checking account. So at that point, the cash that you put into the bank ceases to be part of the money supply, and now it is the demand deposit. So the money supply did not change at all. It just shifted to a different form of money. It shifted from cash, which you possessed and now have given over to the bank, and now once the bank takes that cash, it is no longer money, but now it is a demand deposit, a checking account. Okay, let's talk about the fractional reserve system, which actually grew out of this goldsmith era of producing money. Banks have to keep a fraction of their deposits in their vaults. Okay, now those deposits that are in vaults are not a part of the money supply because that's cash in the bank. But they must keep some of that cash in their vaults because they need to make sure they have cash when people need to take their money out of the bank for whatever purpose. The remaining deposits, though, that aren't held in the vaults can be loaned out to other people. The amount of money that is loaned out will always represent an increase in the money supply. Now, if this concept is difficult for you to grasp, I would urge you to go back to that original slide where we talked about the $5,000 that you got for renovating a kitchen. Money lent out represents an increase in the money supply. Repaid loans represent a decrease in the money supply. That makes sense. As the bank lends out money, they increase the money supply. As people pay back their loans, the money supply decreases. And the Federal Reserve can manage the money supply by changing the percent of deposits that they require to be held in reserve. Okay, so remember, money that's held in the vaults can't be lended out. I'm bad with my grammar there. Can't be lent out. So if the Federal Reserve wants to manipulate the money supply, they can manipulate the amount of money that they require to be held in bank vaults. So let's talk about this Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve was created in 1913. It's managed by a board of governors, and that board of governors is nominated by the President of the United States and approved by the Senate. It consists of 12 regional banks, and each of these regional banks is managed by the board of governors that was discussed in the second bullet point there. And the regional banks are basically the bankers' banks. So for example, if a local bank needs to borrow money they'll go to the Federal Reserve Bank to do that. If a local bank wants to reduce the amount of cash being held in its reserves, they can actually go and deposit their cash at the Federal Reserve Bank. In fact, the Federal Reserve holds most of the reserves and manages the money supply. So very few, well, every bank has some money held or some cash held in vaults, but most of the cash that the banks hold in reserve is actually deposited at the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve holds that cash for the various local banks. The Federal Reserve System consists of 12 banks, and you can see the area that is covered. Here's the Chicago area. The Chicago Federal Reserve Bank takes care of the money supply in this excuse me, in this region here in the Midwest, and you can see there are several other regions as well. The Fed is in charge of what we call monetary policy. Monetary policy is the way that we control the unemployment and inflation in our nation by managing the supply of money. I'm going to stop this presentation right here. I went pretty fast, so if you need to rewind and take good notes on what was covered in this, please go back and do so. We will talk about monetary policy in upcoming lessons, but right now just be aware that it is the Federal Reserve that is in charge of monetary policy, and monetary policy is used to control unemployment and inflation by managing the supply of money. And with that, we're going to stop this presentation. Check Canvas to see what might be in store for you there.